The PM brushes off calls from doctors for a better COVID-19 vaccine awareness campaign.
There's around 65% of the population who's very happy to go on the vaccine. So right now the focus is ensuring that those who are very happy to go and do it, go and do it.
Also ahead, the economic recovery continues with the jobless rate falling to 5.5% last month. But a pay freeze and voluntary redundancies offered at Qantas as most of its international operations remain grounded. And the world's largest iceberg breaks off Antarctica. It's nearly double the size of the ACT. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Kirsten Aiken. Doctors are pushing for a better advertising and awareness strategy to convince more Australians to get their COVID-19 vaccination. They warn we're currently sitting ducks and say they're increasingly alarmed by the number of people hesitant or waiting to get their jabs. For more, I'm now joined by political reporter James Glenday from Canberra. Good afternoon, James. How does Australia's advertising campaign compare to the rest of the world?
Well, I don't want to send any of your viewers, Kirsten, down YouTube holes, but I think once they've watched your show, it's probably worth checking out Singapore's advertising campaign if you haven't already. It has some I think dubious pop is the best way to call it. It's certainly colourful. You look around the world, the United Kingdom has some very high-profile celebrities encouraging people to get the jab and indeed getting vaccinated themselves. Whereas Australia, we have a very telegenic and a very telegenic and a very nice doctor in Nick Coatsworth speaking to people about the importance of getting vaccinated. But there has been some criticism from doctors themselves that advertising campaign is not high profile enough, that the message about the importance of getting vaccinated is not being spread widely enough, and that maybe more money should be spent in this area. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, this morning defended the campaign and what his government was doing so far and said that he thought it was going pretty well. Here's what he had to say.
40 million that the government is investing both this year and next year in the communications campaign. But I'd make this point to you. There's around 65% of the population who's very happy to go on the vaccine. So right now the focus is ensuring that those who are very happy to go and do it, go and do it. And there's plenty of opportunity for them to do that if they're over the 50 at present, and that's why we just simply encourage those who already are happy to go and have that vaccine to go and get that vaccine.
That's what the Prime Minister had to say this morning. James, what does the opposition make of how the government has handled this program?
Yeah, I mean, the opposition's very critical of the way the government's rolled out the vaccine so far, the missed targets and the like, and it's critical also of the vaccine program itself. The opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, said that there are more advertisements for the musical Hamilton than the vaccination strategy at the moment. But it's not really awareness about COVID-19 that people need to, that doctors want to be raised, because everyone's aware that we're in the middle of a pandemic. The awareness they want raised is of the importance of getting a vaccine, and particularly for people over the age of 50 who seem to be quite worried about the risk of blood clots. And there's obviously been a lot of publicity about the AstraZeneca vaccine. And we learned today that about 24 people in total have experienced very rare blood clots in Australia. But that's out of a total caseload of 2.1 million doses. So those clots are very rare. And when you contrast that to how deadly COVID-19 is as a disease, if you get it, then doctors say really getting vaccinated is a no-brainer. The opposition's health spokesman, Mark Butler, was out and about today. He said that the government should be doing more to try to reassure Australians and really encourage as many people as possible to get vaccinated as quick as possible.
At the end of the day, we need to think carefully about the substance of the advertising, but clearly what other countries like New Zealand are relying upon is the incentive to get vaccinated. The fact that the pathway to freedom, as New Zealand calls it, lies in the path of vaccination.
Finally, James, new unemployment figures are out today. What do they show?
Well, they show the impact, effectively, of the end of the job seeker wage subsidy scheme. So once JobKeeper ended, we know about 30,000 jobs in total were lost, but the unemployment rate at the same time actually fell slightly by 0.2%. It's now sitting at 5.5%. Now, this in particular has been a politically charged topic, more than the unemployment rate is normally, because Labor had warned about the removal of the job seeker program. The government claims that these figures show that it did the right thing, wrapping up this massive subsidy scheme and very, very expensive wage subsidy scheme as planned. In fact, the Treasurer Josh Frydenberg said he was very, very pleased with these figures, and it showed that Australia's economy was continuing to roar back to life.
All right, James Glenday in Canberra, thank you. Let's talk a little more about that data out today. Sue Lannon joins me now. Sue, the jobless rate fell, but so did jobs in April.
That's right. And the reason the jobless rate fell is that people dropped out of the workforce. The participation rate had been at a record high. People pulled back. Now, as James Glenday said, 31,000 jobs were lost over the month. Now, the Bureau of Statistics says it's not clear whether or not JobKeeper had an impact, but the jobs that fell were female jobs. So that just does suggest some impact, because female-dominated jobs such as tourism, the food industry, they were very much impacted and being held up by JobKeeper. Now, we've got a graph now, if we can just bring that up. Now, these figures do show the good and bad. So the unemployment rate has dropped from its peak in 7.4% in July last year. The height of the pandemic, it's down nearly 2% to 5.5% for April. That should be April 2021. It's the sixth consecutive fall in the unemployment rate. Youth unemployment also falling to the lowest level since the global financial crisis. And again, the Bureau of Statistics saying they're not sure how much impact the end of JobKeeper had. Now, EY Chief Economist Joe Masters says the numbers are promising despite the fall in jobs.
This data has been really important. We had the end of JobKeeper, and this is the first month of employment numbers that we've got since then. And it does look as if the economy has absorbed the end of that very large, very important policy reasonably well. And that's consistent with the anecdotes that we've been hearing over the last couple of weeks. It's really encouraging. It suggests that the recovery is quite well entrenched, that we can afford to take a little bit of government support out of the economy, but continue to keep Australians in jobs.
Now, the Australian share market was boosted by that fall in the unemployment rate from March to April. Also, bargain hunters moving into the market after yesterday's 2% fall. So in late trade, the ASX 200 index up about 1.3%. Now, most sectors have turned higher, among them finance stocks, real estate, tech stocks, education. Afterpay, the top performer, up more than 7%. But miners and energy stocks going down, although they're off their lows. Commodity prices turned up today. The global software firm NEWSABC has lost 7%. And let's have a look at currencies now. Now, the Australian dollar also picked up after the fall in the unemployment rate in April. It's buying around 77.5 US cents, higher against other major currencies. Now, of course, one very popular currency, Bitcoin, saw another rout overnight after China banned financial institutions from doing digital currency transactions. So let's look at what happened overnight. We saw Bitcoin plunge by 1/3. It fell from around $40,000 US per digital coin to around $30,000 US dollars. And another cryptocurrency, Ethereum, lost nearly half of its value, but they both bounced back in later trade. One of the reasons seems to be after Tesla founder Elon Musk tweeted he was not selling Bitcoin. Well, for more on the mystery that is cryptocurrency, I'm joined now by Professor Jason Potts from the Blockchain Innovation Hub at the RMIT University in Melbourne. Jason Potts, thanks for joining us. So why did we see this big sell-off of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies overnight?
Yeah, thanks. So it's been a very dramatic past 24 hours or so, but the markets have been up a huge amount over the past 6 months. So at some point there was going to be an inevitable trigger for it, whether it was Elon or the Chinese government. There was a lot of leverage in the markets. So in some senses, something was going to trigger this. and it just happened in the past few days.
Yeah, and of course we saw last month Bitcoin reach a record high of $65,000. Now it's just below 40,000, so clearly a big bubble. Should we be saying investor beware?
We should have been saying that right from the start. But I mean, this has been a global sell-off, over this past short period. But that enormous rise that we've seen, that wasn't just happening in Bitcoin and Ethereum. It was happening in all of the cryptocurrencies. So it was broadly a global, whole of market acceleration over the past 6 months. The sort of sell-off that we've seen, I think there's a bit of profit taking involved in that. 20-30% fall, it's an alarming statistic, but that's well within the realm of what we normally see in these bull runs.
Now, of course, it's very volatile. Where do you think prices are going? Will some of the heat come out of the market?
Thanks. Yeah, I wish I knew that. I think there's a lot of sort of long-term bullish sentiment on this. This technology clearly is the future of finance, but it is a new experimental technology. There's a lot of kinks being shaken out. There was a lot of new players came into the markets over the past year or so. There's a huge amount of leverage. So there are a lot of problems to address in this. So I think in some sense this is a welcome correction.
Does there need to be government regulation?
Yes, absolutely. Again, this is a global 24-hour a day market. The main sort of problem here is a lot of just investor uncertainty around exactly what these assets are. There's a need for governments to step in and just at least clarify what types of, how these assets will be treated from a tax perspective, from a financial regulatory perspective. There's a lot of uncertainty in this space, and I think there's an important role for government in clarifying that.
And what about central banks? Some central banks looking at creating some sort of digital currency. Is that what's needed to make it official?
Look, that's a very different thing. So I think the future of money is digital, and central bank digital currencies are one way to do that. Cryptocurrencies, which are a decentralized version, is another way to do that. We may well end up with a hybrid of both. What we saw in China overnight, effectively, was that the government is wanting to introduce its own central bank digital currency, and to do that it needs to clear away the clear demand for and use of the cryptocurrency. So we're going to have digital money in some form. Exactly what architecture that takes, whether it's run by central banks or it's an algorithmic protocol-based cryptocurrency, that lies in the future.
Jason Potts from RMIT University in Melbourne, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Sue.
And now a quick recap of cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin buying around $40,000 per digital coin. And Ethereum has also regained some of its losses. It's down nearly 14% at $2,500 per digital coin. And that's finance.
Thanks, Sue. The Queensland Government will spend $7.5 million on a package to lure workers to take up tourism jobs in regional Queensland. Job seekers will be offered a $1,500 incentive to relocate, as well as $250 in travel vouchers. Christy Sexton-McGrath has more.
The Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk made the announcement here in Cairns. The city is heavily reliant on tourism and traditionally relies on international tourists to fill the job market. When international borders shut, the work source dried up, and many tourism businesses have been struggling to find staff, particularly as domestic travellers start to flow back to the region. Here's what the Premier had to say a short time ago.
What people are saying is they need more assistance with hospitality workers, cooks, chefs, and in our hotels we can open up more bedrooms if we can get some cleaners and more staff to work in our hotels as well. So it's a good problem to have, and we just hope that this $7.5 million package will actually help the industry.
The incentives will be on offer for jobs in a region stretching north from Mackay, as well as inland regions west of Toowoomba. Tourism authorities have welcomed the announcement, including the Chief Executive of Tourism Tropical North Queensland, Mark Olsen.
This is paradise, but it is not the paradise that makes the difference, it's the people that make the difference. It's the talented workforce who create those memorable moments. And what we want to be able to do this winter is help so many of those businesses who are trying to close the $2 billion gap left behind by COVID in 2020.
The scheme kicks off on the 1st of July, just in time for Far North Queensland's peak holiday season.
Qantas has announced a 2-year wage freeze for staff and is offering voluntary redundancies for international cabin crew as the impact of COVID-19 continues to hit the travel industry. The CEO, Alan Joyce, says there's no other company in Australia that's been impacted worse by the pandemic's economic downturn.
We expect to post a statutory loss before tax of more than $2 billion in financial year 21. That's on top of the $2.7 billion of losses last year. We also know that the pandemic will have cost us at least $16 billion since the start of 2020 in lost revenue by the end of this financial year. I think it's safe to say there's no other company in Australia that's had a bigger impact from COVID than the Qantas Group.
Alan Joyce earlier. Jordan Chong is an aviation journalist and he joins me now from Sydney. Good afternoon and welcome to you. Aviation has been dealt a terribly difficult blow by the pandemic. What shape does today's market update suggest Qantas is in?
Well, when you lose $16 billion in revenue, that suggests that it's had a massive impact. There are some encouraging points there, Kirsten. There's, they talk about the domestic travel continuing to grow and, capacity being back to almost where it was pre-COVID in the domestic market. And so those are encouraging signs. But clearly with international borders closed to everyone but the travel bubble with New Zealand, that the domestic market isn't going to replace all those international seats that Qantas was operating and selling prior to the coronavirus pandemic.
The Flight Attendants Association says Qantas has failed to bargain in good faith with unions by failing to consult them about the 2-year wage freeze. Do you think Qantas can justify the measure?
I think it's up to Qantas to make the argument. I would say that, more broadly, if you look at the official government statistics, wages haven't grown anywhere to any great extent in across Australia for a while. Whether you would think a 2.7 loss before tax last year and a loss before tax this year of up to $2 billion, requires a 2-year wage freeze. I guess you'd have to have Qantas to make that argument. Like I said, you just have to look around, and wages aren't really growing anywhere in the economy right now.
How many international flight attendants is Qantas hoping will seek redundancy, and will it pursue compulsory redundancies if not enough apply?
Well, at this stage, Qantas said today they're expecting several hundred of its international cabin crew to sign up or register their interest in taking a voluntary redundancy package. I think whether that's enough, I guess, depends on whether Qantas can restart some international flying to other places through, government-approved travel bubbles or otherwise. But at this stage, they've just said it's several hundred.
How much money would it be costing Qantas to keep the majority of its international operation on the ground?
Well, I guess operationally, they've got some aircraft that are in storage or hibernation. Those aircraft require regular maintenance, so that would be a cost. There also, I guess, the need to, they've talked about having staff that have been stood down during this pandemic. When and if the time comes where they can resume flying again, they can be stood up. So, there are a number of different things that Qantas has also been doing. They've talked about operating some cargo-only flights to keep the freight movement into the out of the country going. So those flights have been operated by previously passenger aircraft. So there are a number of different measures that Qantas has put in place while it's not flying anywhere internationally apart from New Zealand.
Will it be an easy thing to scale back up once the company is permitted to increase international travel?
I think whether it's easy or difficult, I think it's more a case of that there's just some procedures that you need to go through. I guess you need to stand your employees back up, your cabin crew and your pilots and your technicians. You need to get those aircraft that have been in hibernation back into a state where they can be flown again, and that's a lot of checks, a lot of maintenance work to make sure that those aircraft are brought back to life, if you like. And there's also a lot of just administrative things, like just making sure that you've got takeoff and landing slots at the airports overseas, and you can get the your marketing unit going again to sell those tickets, to make sure that they're available through all the distribution channels that are available nowadays. So it's a process, and Qantas has been through this because domestic was very, very quiet for large parts of last year, but they've managed to revive that part of the business. I can't see why international should be any different.
Well, just finally, I did want to ask you on that point, what is your sense of Australians' appetite to fly overseas once they're allowed to?
Well, I would say that the long-term trend is that aviation has grown steadily for decades. People have friends and family overseas. People have links to business and various other humanitarian work, and all those sorts of linkages that we've had with other countries and other peoples. I think there is a need to connect again in person. So the growth rate or the return to pre-COVID levels might take a few years, but I think if you look at the long-term trends, you can't help but think that aviation and passenger travel internationally will again return.
Aviation journalist Jordan Chong, great to speak to you.
Thanks, Kirsten, anytime.
A Tasmanian man has been found guilty of murdering his friend almost 3 years ago. Monica Champ reports from Launceston.
It took the jury 4.5 hours to unanimously find Jack Harrison Vincent Sadler guilty of murder. The 29-year-old fatally shot, beheaded and then dismembered his 24-year-old friend Jake Anderson Bretner over a drug debt in Launceston in August 2018. Sadler and his then fiancée Gemma Clark disposed of his body in wheelie bins around northern Tasmania. The court heard Sadler had a room in his home lined with plastic, set up for the killing. He'd arranged to meet with Mr Anderson Bretner to ease tensions over a 6-figure drug debt. Jurors heard Sadler and his victim had been friends since 2014 and had developed a drug dealing operation together. Sadler would get illicit drugs from Victorian suppliers he knew through working as a bouncer at a Launceston nightclub, and Mr Anderson Bretner would sell them around the city. But the court heard Mr Anderson Bretner racked up a more than $100,000 debt, and Sadler was copping flack over it. The victim's family were in court as the guilty verdict was read out.
God, just really thankful to the DPP. They've done an amazing job. And the police, they've been wonderful too. But I'd like to say that, my son, he was priceless.
Sadler will return to court next Friday when he'll be sentenced.
A South Australian man has had a blood clot linked to the AstraZeneca vaccine. He had his first dose on May the 4th and was admitted to hospital on the 18th. The 53-year-old is said to be in a very serious condition and is in intensive care. SA's Chief Public Health Officer, Dr Nicola Spurrier, says there is also another probable case.
With this particular syndrome that has been linked to the AstraZeneca vaccine, it can occur anywhere from 4 days up to 28 days after having the vaccination. So it is important for people that have had the AZ vaccine to monitor themselves for symptoms, and when they go and have the vaccine, they should be provided with information about what those things are. And it includes having a severe persistent headache or a severe abdominal pain.
There has been only one death from thrombosis, with thrombocytopenia linked to the AstraZeneca vaccine in Australia. All confirmed and probable cases are in a stable condition and making a recovery. About 2.1 million doses have been administered so far. Only 21 cases of the blood clotting syndrome have been confirmed. Israel's Prime Minister has vowed to continue strikes on Gaza, where more than 200 people have been killed, including 64 children. Benjamin Netanyahu says he's determined to continue the offensive until its objective is achieved, while a senior Hamas official says he expects a ceasefire to be reached within days, even as cross-border attacks escalate. Israel has carried out hundreds of airstrikes on Gaza in the past day, which it says are targeting militant infrastructure. Close to 4,000 rockets have been fired at Israeli cities, hundreds of which have fallen short, with others intercepted by the Iron Dome.
You can either conquer them, and that's always an open possibility, or you can deter them. And we are engaged right now in forceful deterrence, but I have to say, we don't rule out anything. We hope we can restore quiet. We hope we can restore it quickly.
Earlier, the US President Joe Biden urged Benjamin Netanyahu to seek a de-escalation in the 10-day conflict. That's despite the US mission saying it won't support a UN Security Council resolution on the matter. And tonight on the News Channel, we'll have a special program on the Israel-Gaza conflict hosted by Stan Grant. As calls grow for a ceasefire, Stan will examine the reasons behind the cycle of violence. That's at 8 p.m. Eastern here on the News Channel and anytime on ABC iView. Spain's government is urging regional authorities to accept hundreds of unaccompanied children and teenagers who swam or climbed into the Spanish enclave of Ceuta from Morocco. Around 8,000 migrants have arrived in Ceuta over the past 2 days, seeking a quick way into Europe. They included 1,500 miners like this teenager who braved the water crossing using empty plastic bottles to help keep him afloat. Other children, some as young as 7, have had to be plucked to safety by Spanish police divers. Around 2/3 of the migrants have now been sent back, but the children are being kept in crammed reception centres because it's illegal to deport minors in Spain. Health authorities in Malawi have destroyed nearly 20,000 expired doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine because they couldn't be used in time. The vials were part of a shipment of more than 100,000 doses that arrived in March, with the use-by date of April, leaving less than 3 weeks for them to be used. The government managed to administer 80% of them, but decided to destroy the rest. The Health Minister said it's important to build public confidence in the vaccine program.
A statement came from WHO which said, no, even if it was expired, we still could use it. But as a country, we had already made a decision that we're not going to use any expired vaccine.
The WHO has since reversed its position and now says vaccines beyond their expiration date should be destroyed. More than 6 months after closing its doors due to the pandemic, France's most famous museum, the Louvre, has reopened to visitors. It is the first stage of the government's plan to unwind COVID restrictions. The nightly curfew has been pushed back to 9 p.m. and bars and restaurants and cultural venues are back to partial capacity.
This morning it was a big emotion. We were nearly crying, but with the big smile, maybe a bigger smile than the Mona Lisa, to welcome visitors.
France's infection numbers are falling and more than 20 million people have had at least one COVID vaccine dose. The government warns it could reverse the easing of restrictions if infections rise again. Back home in the New South Wales government has acquired 5,000 litres of a high-strength poison to help tackle the ongoing mouse plague. It comes with concerns the plague could reach Greater Sydney by August. Reporter Amelia Bernasconi has more from Tamworth in the state's northeast.
The state government says it secured enough of the chemical bromadiolone to last about 7 to 10 days. Now, the state's farmers have been grappling with this mouse plague for months now. Many have reported losses of crop and grain into the tens of thousands. Others have been forced to burn hay reserved for the next drought, and that can come up into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The State Agriculture Minister has announced a $50 million package. As part of that, farmers will be able to have their grain treated for free at a number of sites sites to be set up across the state with that bromadiolone. The catch is the national regulator is yet to approve the use of bromadiolone. The state's Agriculture Minister says it's among the highest toxicity of mouse bait in the world that the state government could get their hands on. So until we have that approval from the regulator, it's sort of stalling a little bit as we continue to battle the mouse plague. The next question is from ecologists and even farmers themselves about secondary poisoning from bromadiolone to wildlife and as well as, farm animals and working dogs. So those questions will be answered. Of course, the APVMA, the regulator, will not be making approvals without doing its due diligence. So until then, we'll wait and see. The Agriculture Minister, though, says as soon as it's given the green light, they can move ahead with these treatment stations from the supply secured within Australia. There's also another few thousand litres on its way from overseas, so very confident the state's Agriculture Minister in securing that approval, getting this bromadiolone distributed to farmers and hopefully helping them combat this mouse plague.
Taking a quick look at the weather for the capitals for tomorrow. Partly cloudy in Brisbane, a shower or two in Sydney, sunny in Canberra, early fog, then sunshine in Melbourne, mostly sunny in Hobart, sunny in Adelaide too with a top of 23 degrees and mostly sunny conditions in Perth and Darwin. You can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on iView. Here are the top stories on ABC News this afternoon. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has defended the government's current vaccine awareness campaign amid mounting criticism. Medical experts are calling for a stronger public information campaign, with concerns not enough Australians are rolling up their sleeves. Countries like the UK and New Zealand have made emotive videos to promote the take-up of the jab, and the Australian Medical Association wants Australia to follow suit. The most recent jobs figures have seen the unemployment rate fall to 5.5% despite the end of JobKeeper earlier this year. The youth jobless rate also fell to its lowest levels in over a decade. That's despite around 31,000 jobs being lost in April. That's according to the Bureau of Statistics. Qantas has announced a 2-year pay freeze as the airline continues to struggle with the closure of international borders. The carrier is forecasting a before-tax loss of more than $2 billion for the current financial year and is expecting hundreds of more redundancies in the coming months. Meanwhile, Virgin Australia is promising to launch more than 700 weekly flights and create new jobs. And Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to continue strikes on Gaza until its objective is achieved. Meanwhile, a senior Hamas official says he expects a ceasefire to be reached within days. Israel has carried out hundreds of airstrikes on Gaza in 24 hours, and close to 4,000 rockets have been fired at Israeli cities by Hamas. Medical professionals are urging the government to bolster its coronavirus vaccination awareness campaign because of fears the take-up of the vaccine is too low. The Australian Medical Association says people will be sitting ducks for a wave of infections from overseas if more people don't get vaccinated soon. The UK and New Zealand have produced vaccine campaigns which are receiving positive reviews. The AMA's Dr. Chris Moy says something similar should be replicated here.
I think what they're doing is exactly what needs to happen, which is really the message about why people need the vaccine. Certainly, unfortunately, because we've been the victims of our own success and done so well in keeping COVID out, people are not perceiving any risk. And I know that there's a massive risk for the tsunami of COVID out there. And also, all they're hearing is negative stories, which are either about this very rare clotting type condition or they're politicised. And really what we need is the opposite, which is really that, number one, that it's about making sure that each person's protected, but also that each vaccination is a community effort to actually protect the next person along the line, and also to get us to a much more positive world at some stage where we may be able to get back to a more normal life and open up at some stage. To some degree, what's been happening recently, the messaging has been very solid in terms of the actual information, but relatively dry, if I could put it that way. What we need is actually stuff that connects with people, that fits with not only, the messaging that they can understand in a simple way, but also connects with them and is also culturally appropriate, because we do need to consider the message needs to go not only to you know, to the main population, but also to other populations which are going to have greater difficulty obtaining that information, such as those with limited English or those with Indigenous populations, for example. You may have heard already that the figures for vaccine hesitancy have gone up from around about 20%, which when we first started, to, you know, in the 30s to the high 30%. And that is a barrier, a significant barrier in itself. And certainly anecdotally, we're seeing situations where people are either cancelling their appointments or making decisions to hold out for, you know, what they perceive. And I think there's a lot of debate about this, about what they perceive to be maybe what they think is a better vaccine at the end of the year. The thing is that in the meantime, what's actually happening is, from people like myself, we're seeing what the world is like, and we are essentially sitting ducks at the moment. And if there's an outbreak, then we have a serious risk, and then we'll be coming from behind. And it's very difficult to catch up at that point. So the message out there is, first up, we are at risk. We do need to get the vaccinations, but also it is a community thing, and that's the thing. I think we have this community spirit at the beginning of the pandemic where everybody pulled together. We need to also understand that the vaccination program is a community effort as well that is really important in the longer term.
A New South Wales woman found guilty